He had once been the kind of man who made the entire city of Chicago hesitate before speaking his name, a kingpin of the underworld whose heart had frozen beneath layers of pride and a past steeped in darkness. Just one phone call, one fleeting moment he chose to ignore, and that very second became the quiet point in time when he lost everything without even realizing it. She was carrying his child, and he had no idea what was truly waiting on the other side of that unanswered ring. Listen closely to that fateful night, the night when the world he had once controlled collapsed completely, and when that small, fragile life became the only reason for him to keep breathing and fighting through the rest of his days. Chicago at night seemed wrapped in a velvet black curtain, thick and strangely still. The wind drifting in from Lake Michigan brushed past the tall buildings, sweeping across sparsely lit streets and shimmering against the polished windows of limousines parked silently along the curbs. On the 46th floor of a downtown tower, a place ordinary people would never dare set foot in, Gavin Cole stood alone by a glass wall stretching from floor to ceiling, his blade-sharp gaze looking down at the city he had once ruled with an iron hand. He wore a charcoal gray suit, a white shirt pressed without a single misplaced crease, a black tie knotted so tightly it seemed as if every thread were part of the armor he used to face the world. His hair was neatly combed, his face stern and unreadable, and only his deep-shadowed eyes betrayed a quiet exhaustion no one would ever dare look directly into. The penthouse around him was drowned in an almost suffocating silence, lit only by the dim glow of the crystal ceiling fixtures and the warm amber light of the low-bar lamp reflecting softly against the cold stone wall behind him. On the table rested a half-finished glass of whiskey, its amber hue shimmering inside crystal, and beside it lay a silent, untouched phone. No music, no voices, no trace of human presence other than his own. The entire room felt suspended in a moment where power and loneliness clung to each other like inseparable shadows. Gavin Cole was not a man who revealed emotion. He had been shaped by obedience, accustomed to giving orders with a glance, capable of breaking his enemies with a single sentence. He had built his empire through blood, cold precision, and decisions that never wavered. Yet in this moment, with the night pressing against the thick glass and every sound swallowed by the stillness, something unfamiliar stirred inside him, not quite regret, not quite longing, but a quiet, hollow opening within the layers of pride forged over 15 years. That was when he thought of Emily, her name drifting through his mind like a faint breeze brushing across skin long accustomed to harsh winds. Emily Harris, the one woman who had ever looked at him without fear, the one who believed that behind the armor of a kingpin lived a heart, capable of loving and hurting. She had walked away nearly 1 year ago without blame or accusation, leaving behind nothing but a final look filled with serenity and despair. He had not stopped her. He believed strength meant letting her go. But the truth was that from the moment she stepped out of this apartment, silence began creeping into his nights like an unnamed curse. The room remained still until a faint vibration hummed against the marble surface of the table. He turned, the screen lit up in the dark like a solitary spark. A name appeared, familiar enough to make his chest tighten: Emily. For a breath he stood motionless, his fingers frozen midair, one side of him reaching instinctively, wanting to hear her voice, the other side bound by pride whispering that no one should return to the past. He drew in a slow breath. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, a cold, unfeeling replica. And he let the phone ring until the screen faded to black, restoring the silence. Gavin returned to his whiskey, draining what remained as if swallowing every shred of conflict within him. He did not know that at that very moment, somewhere else in the city, the woman carrying his child was fighting between life and death. And he, the man who once controlled everything, had just lost the most important thing in his life simply because he did not pick up. If you are still listening at this point, thank you for taking the time to step into the quiet, aching corners of Gavin Cole's inner world. This story is only beginning, and what comes next will tighten your throat even more. If you felt something stir within you, even the faint skip of a heartbeat or the brush of a distant memory, I invite you to subscribe, to like this video, and to share it with someone who might also need a story that reaches into the deepest places of the heart. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment with the name of your city or your state. We would love to know how far this story has traveled on the map, and who is here with us in this still, fragile moment. I will see you in the next chapter, where fate begins to speak through the sound of unanswered rings. The phone began to vibrate again, long and quiet, like the soft knocking of fate on a door Gavin had ignored too many times. The name on the screen was still the same, Emily Harris, 4 simple words that seemed to tear through the stillness and cut into the darkness he had spent years burying deep inside himself. He stared at the glowing screen in the half-lit room, the pale blue light glinting across the cold glass wall behind him and striking the tired eyes of a man who had never allowed himself the luxury of weakness. The whiskey glass touched the table without a sound, yet his fingers tightened so hard the knuckles turned white. Uninvited memories rushed through his mind. Emily, smiling in the soft glow of morning light, the quiet laugh she gave whenever she teased him for trying to hide what he truly felt, and the silent, resigned look in her eyes the day she walked away without turning back. He had once believed it was freedom, the end of a love that could never survive between 2 worlds carved from such different truths. He was darkness, and she was the only trace of light that had ever made him feel human. The vibration stopped, then returned, persistent, stubborn, as though the voice on the other side was a soul trying to pull him back from the edge of the emptiness he had built around himself. But he stood there unmoving. The principles that had held together his image as a cold, untouchable kingpin began to waver, yet the steel-clad pride wrapped around his heart remained, whispering that if he answered, he would be weak. He would be admitting he still needed her. He would be letting emotion override reason. And for a man like Gavin Cole, that was unforgivable. He turned away, closing his eyes for a brief moment as if the simple act of not seeing her name would silence the chaos rising inside him. He thought of the countless calls he had ignored in his life, from partners, enemies, the police, even family. None of them had ever made him hesitate. One call from the past, from the woman who had once stepped out of his life, should not have been different. He told himself that, repeating it in his mind like a broken incantation. But logic and instinct no longer stood on the same side. His heart tightened with a faint ache, a quiet warning that something was wrong, something was breaking, something was about to be lost, something far greater than any deal he had secured or any life he had taken. The phone stopped vibrating, this time for much longer. No more flashing light, only the familiar sound of a silent room and the ticking of the wall clock carving each passing second like a thin blade against skin. Gavin poured another drink, his hand unsteady despite his refusal to acknowledge it. He lowered himself into the leather chair beside the table, leaned back, and closed his eyes, forcing down the unease rising like an undertow from a place he could not control. The night stretched on, and the city outside slept peacefully, unaware that a quiet choice had just reshaped a life in the penthouse above it all. A call unanswered, a voice abandoned in silence, a heart breaking somewhere far away, a sound Gavin could not hear. And he still believed he had done the right thing, that the past should remain locked away, that no one could make him waver. But fate does not need his permission to begin its punishment. And he did not yet know that in the moment he turned his back on that ringing phone, his life had already shifted into a direction no power, no wealth, and no amount of coldness would ever be able to mend again. At the same time that Gavin sat motionless in the cold stillness of his penthouse, not far away, inside an aging apartment complex in the southern part of Chicago, Emily Harris was curled on the cold tile floor, one hand pressed against the violent tightening in her lower belly, the other trembling as it clung to the edge of a table for balance. Her small apartment was so quiet that the ticking of the clock echoed like a tap against every frayed nerve. The kitchen light flickered, its worn bulb on the verge of burning out, casting a thin yellow glow across peeling walls and throwing faint shadows over her pale, sweat-soaked face. Her breathing grew shallow and uneven. She folded forward, her whole body tightening as a sudden wave of pain surged from deep within, twisting through her like a set of claws dragging through every inch of her insides. The baby was coming, not at the right time, not in the right place, and certainly not with the right person by her side. She bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out, pressing her hand to her strained, rounded belly, as if she could somehow soothe the tiny life struggling inside her. The baby had been moving since around midnight, but this was no longer simple movement. These were real contractions, deep and long, sending searing pain across her back until she could no longer stand upright. Inch by inch, she dragged herself across the floor, trying to reach the landline phone perched on a small shelf near the sink. Sweat gathered on her forehead, slipping down her neck and soaking the thin, worn fabric of the maternity dress she had been wearing for nearly a week. Her heart pounded with such force it felt as if it would burst from her chest. Whenever the pain eased for even a breath, she inhaled deeply, eyes fixed on the ceiling to keep herself conscious. She could not faint, not when she was alone in this apartment, not when the baby could arrive at any moment, and especially not when Gavin still knew nothing. Despite all the reasons she had left him, despite the pride she had fiercely protected, in this fragile moment between life and death, between clarity and delirium, his name was still the first that rose in her mind. Not because she had forgiven him, but because somewhere deep within her she believed that no matter how ruthless he was with the world, Gavin would never turn away if she truly needed him. But Emily had been wrong. She knew it when the earlier calls had gone unanswered, and again when the ring she had just dialed stretched on with no one picking up. Tears began to spill, not from pain but from the crushing weight of being left behind, utterly alone. She placed a hand on her belly again, feeling the small, weakening movements of the child. The baby was still alive, still fighting, and she had to do the same. She clenched her jaw and whispered through a broken breath, a prayer sent into the dim air. "Do not give up. I'm here. I will try a little longer. All right, my love." Her back struck the leg of a chair, sending another wave of agony crashing through her. She bit down hard to keep from screaming. In her mind, the imagined ringing of the phone echoed, reminding her of the call that had been ignored. She did not blame Gavin. Truthfully, she had never expected him to come back. What hurt more than the pain tearing through her body was facing the most important moment of her life with no one beside her. No family, no friends, no one. Only the baby and the fragile thread of her own life hanging between two worlds she was not sure she could cross without a miracle. But miracles rarely belong to the forgotten, and tonight, in a small apartment tucked inside a restless city, Emily Harris understood she was stepping into a birth she might not survive to retell. She stretched herself toward the landline phone, her trembling fingertips brushing the worn wooden surface that had been faded by years. She had to summon every last ounce of strength just to pull herself forward those few remaining inches, her hand scraping through the air like she was reaching for the final hope left in this long, dark night. The next contraction struck like a tidal wave, curling her body inward as cold sweat gathered along her spine, draining what little strength she had left. But with one last push of will, her fingers reached the receiver. She lifted it, dialing Gavin's number with practiced precision. Each number etched so deeply in her memory she did not need to see them to recall them. The line began to ring on the other end. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3 rings. No one answered. No voice. No breath. Only the hollow whisper of waiting humming through the line. Emily pressed the receiver hard against her ear, her heart pounding wildly, her gaze flicking to the clock on the wall showing 3:17 in the morning. She fought to steady her voice, fought to breathe evenly so she could speak clearly if Gavin picked up, but the line offered nothing in return, only the cold, monotonous ringing echoing into a vast emptiness. She hung up the phone. She did not give in. She dialed again, this time on her cell. She pressed the numbers and called once more. It rang, and still no one answered. She bit her lip until it bled, her hand tightening around the receiver, as if she wanted to snap that cold, unfeeling piece of metal in two. She called a 3rd time, a 4th, refusing to stop, refusing to care about anything, except the hope that someone, somewhere, would pick up. Each ring was a fragment of her last remaining faith wearing thin. Gavin did not answer, not even as she needed him most, not even as she fought alone against the edge of life and death. Emily let her forehead drop against the edge of the table, the receiver still pressed to her ear, now delivering nothing but the flat, mechanical tone informing her that the person she was trying to reach could not come to the phone. She no longer cried. Her tears had dried long ago, leaving only numbness spreading slowly from her fingers into her chest. Inside her belly, the baby moved again, a faint, weak shift that jolted her back to focus. She drew a deep breath and whispered to herself, as if speaking to someone deep within, her own bones. "You have to hold on. You must not fall. For the baby." She set the receiver down and reached for her cell phone, her hand sliding across the lightly cracked screen as she opened her contacts and tapped the only name she had ever saved under a single letter, G. The screen displayed the words "calling in progress," followed by the long, unbroken ringing. This time, a voicemail greeting came on after 7 rings. "This is Gavin. Leave a message if it truly matters." She held her breath for one trembling second, then spoke, her voice hoarse and broken, every word tearing its way through the raw pain in her throat. "Gavin, it's me. I think I'm going into labor. I need you. Please. If you hear this message, please. Do not leave me alone." She ended the call before tears could spill again. No one was coming. No family. No reply. Only the hollow room, the damp smell from the aging walls, the wind slipping through the crack in the window frame, and the quiet heaviness of loneliness settling over her like a fog with no path out. In the darkness, the last flicker of the faulty light blinked once, then went out completely. Everything sank into shadow. And Emily lay there, her hand wrapped around her belly, her breath labored, her heart thudding in a fragile rhythm that matched the fading flicker of hope inside her. She had no idea whether Gavin would ever hear that message, but she knew she had done all she could. And that was all she had left before the next wave of pain surged and pulled her deeper into a darkness more profound than despair. Across the city, where the street lights streaked against glass like thin threads of gold, Gavin Cole still sat motionless in his wide leather chair, one hand resting lightly on the second glass of whiskey he had yet to drink. His cell phone lay beside him, its screen lighting up and fading, the repeated vibrations making the marble tabletop tremble just enough to feel like a persistent reminder he refused to acknowledge. He glanced toward it, something faint flickering across his expression before settling back into the familiar coldness he wore like armor. Emily's relentless calls were not only an interruption, they were a knocking against a part of his memory he had locked tight, caged like a dying animal he refused to let loose again. He exhaled, low and tired, lifted the glass, and swirled the amber liquid beneath the muted yellow light, watching it swirl like thoughts he wished he could drown. He murmured to himself, his voice rough and deep, as though reciting a declaration he needed to believe. No. Do not go back. Do not break. She chose to leave. She knew this life was not for her. She ended it. Then he should learn to end it too. These words were not crafted to convince anyone else, only to steady his own pulse, to reassure himself that ignoring the ringing was the right choice, the strong choice, the necessary one. He had once vowed never to let emotion interfere with his decisions again, because every emotion carried the cost of loss. Emily had been proof of that. And he believed what was happening now was nothing more than another test from fate, one he should face with the same cold resolve that had carried him through a lifetime of scars. The phone vibrated again, this time longer, as if begging for one final fragment of attention. Gavin turned his face away, his eyes avoiding the name appearing on the screen, like a man hiding from a truth he knew would split the armor around his heart wide open if he dared look. He rose and walked to the bar, pouring more whiskey into the glass even though he had no desire to drink it. He simply needed something for his hands to do, something to drown out the ring that had become a plea for help he was determined not to hear. When the call shifted into voicemail, a breath slipped from his chest, so soft he could not tell whether it was relief or something tightening sharply inside him. The alert of a new voice message sounded immediately after. Gavin stood still, the half-filled glass in his hand, his eyes fixed on the phone as though something unseen held him there. He knew that with a single tap on that small icon he would hear Emily's voice, the voice he had tried to forget for nearly an entire year, the voice that once made him feel he was not entirely monstrous, hovered just one touch away, yet he did not reach for it. He turned his back, set the glass down on the counter, his hand trembling despite the steadiness he fought to maintain. Then he silenced the phone, a clean, merciless gesture, like an invisible blade slicing through the last fragile thread, binding two people who had once loved each other with a conviction that felt like destiny. He lifted his gaze into the dim haze before him, forcing himself to believe this was the right thing to do. Emily will be fine, he told himself in silence, the voice inside his head small and quivering as though even he did not believe a word of it. She only wanted to talk. She will call again another time. Nothing is wrong. It is all coincidence. She is strong. She does not need me. These excuses drifted into the air like scraps of weightless paper, unable to cover the growing unease tightening inside his chest, yet Gavin held to his decision. He stepped out onto the balcony, letting the sharp Chicago wind numb his skin, trying to freeze every sense before doubt could pierce him. He did not know that in the very moment he turned away, fate had shifted in a direction from which his life would never return, and the call he had refused was the final plea of a woman fighting alone for her life, whispering his name into the dark. The next contraction struck Emily like a violent wave, sweeping away the last remnants of strength she had left. She collapsed onto the freezing floor, her hand slipping from the phone, her fingers dragging weakly across the tile before her entire body sank like a broken branch felled in a storm. A thin, fractured sound escaped her throat, so faint it was almost swallowed whole by the darkness filling every corner of the small apartment. Sweat streamed down her face, her eyes wide but fading, staring into the empty air as if searching for something to hold on to. Her arm tightened around her belly, her breaths cut into sharp, trembling pieces, her chest rising in shallow movements, each inhale a battle against the presence of death lurking in the shadows. The baby inside still moved, but weaker now, and Emily felt it in every fragile tremor beneath her ribs. The only sound left in her mind was the echo of her own frantic heartbeat, helpless and despairing. No one heard her, no one knew. Gavin did not answer, and she was out of time. Outside, the dim lights from the aging apartment complex cast pale reflections across the peeling hallway walls. The door of Unit 24 remained slightly ajar, the faint glow and soft sounds from inside trapped behind it. But sometimes fate leaves a sliver of mercy, even the smallest one. Mrs. Linda, the widowed neighbor across the hall, woke in the night at the faint clatter slipping through the crack beneath her door. She was used to the unusual stillness of the building, so the noise stirred her instincts. She wrapped herself in a wool robe and peered out. No light, no clear sound. But something tugged at her, something that only mothers understand. She crossed the hall and knocked lightly on Emily's door. No answer. She called her name, twice more. Still silence. Just as she turned to leave, she heard it, a barely there sound drifting from within, a soft, broken whimper, like the final breath of a small bird caught in a trap. Mrs. Linda did not hesitate again. She pushed the door open, and the light from the hallway spilled across the room, revealing a scene that made her freeze in shock. Emily lay curled on the floor, her face chalk white, her arms wrapped around her belly, her body rigid with pain as sweat pooled beneath her. Mrs. Linda rushed to her, dropping to her knees, her hands trembling as she touched Emily's shoulder, her voice cracking with fear when she realized the young woman's belly had dropped, hardened, and the contractions were stretching longer and longer without pause. Without wasting another second, she grabbed her phone and called emergency services, keeping her other hand on Emily as though afraid she might slip away before help could reach them. Meanwhile, at the far end of the street, the sound of sirens began to rise, soft at first, then swelling like an alarm threading its way through the thick night. The red and white ambulance slid past rows of aging buildings, its spinning lights washing over peeling paint and half-shut windows. They arrived less than 5 minutes after the call. The doors burst open, and 2 paramedics rushed inside with a stretcher as Mrs. Linda stumbled through her trembling explanation, her voice thin and broken. By then, Emily was barely conscious, her eyes unable to stay open, her lips forming sounds that no longer shaped themselves into words. She did not know where she was, did not know whether she was still alive or drifting somewhere between reality and a dim, dreamlike haze. But when a nurse's cold hand brushed her forehead, a faint flicker of warmth moved through her. She tried to speak, and only one word rose, half a plea, half a final breath. Gavin. They placed an oxygen mask over her face, slid an IV needle beneath her skin, and lifted her onto the stretcher as gently as lifting a fragile blossom ready to fall from its stem. The door closed behind them, leaving only an empty room and the phone lying abandoned on the floor, its dim screen glowing with the words "one new voice message." No one heard it. And the one man who should have heard it still sat surrounded by liquor and pride in a penthouse across the city, unaware that the life of the woman who had loved him more than anyone else was now in the hands of strangers, carried through the streets of a city that had shaped the fate of countless men, but could no longer save the heart fading quietly in the dark. The cry of the ambulance echoed through the empty early morning streets, cutting through the cold mist blanketing Chicago. Inside the narrow, brightly lit compartment, Emily lay motionless on the stretcher, her face pale as paper, her lips dry and trembling between shallow breaths. The oxygen mask cupped the lower half of her face, IV lines threaded into her arm, the monitors beside her flickering with shifting heart rate and blood pressure readings. Sweat still poured from her, soaking the thin fabric at her back, while the contractions grew sharper, more violent, forcing her hands to clutch the blanket so tightly her knuckles turned white. She drifted in and out of awareness, suspended in a fog between delirium and consciousness, where time stretched apart in disjointed fragments, and voices around her washed into her ears, as if from a distant, unreachable world. In that painful haze, one name rose clearer than any other sound. Gavin. She whispered it the first time, a breath so faint no one heard. The second time, she forced her lips apart, pushing out a whisper that nearly dissolved into the air. Gavin. She did not know if she was dreaming or alive, did not know how much time remained, did not know whether her body still had the strength to bring her child into the world. But the only certainty she held was this: her baby was still inside her, still alive, still fighting. And with whatever remained of her strength, she had to fight to keep the baby safe. A savage contraction tore through her, arching her body even though the paramedics held her firmly against the stretcher. She screamed, the first clear sound she had made, not out of fear but because the pain had crossed the threshold of what a weakening spirit could bear. A young nurse leaned close, pressing her hand to Emily's hardened belly, speaking urgently, to the doctor beside her. Emily could not understand the words. Everything faded into a watery echo, like sound passing through thick glass. In her mind, images tangled and blurred together the paper plane she and Gavin once folded and threw from a window, the look in his eyes the last time he saw her without speaking, the gray maternity dress she had bought with the meager wages from the small bookstore on the corner, and then the memory of Gavin's hand resting lightly on her belly, that one rare night when he had allowed himself to be fragile. She called his name again, this time clearer, trembling but strong enough to make the two paramedics exchange a glance. One of them gently took her hand, murmuring reassurance. "We are almost there." "Hold on." But Emily shook her head weakly, not because she did not want to hold on, but because she no longer knew how much strength remained in her body. The baby inside her still moved, but not with the vigor from earlier, and that weakening flutter cut deeper into her heart than any physical pain. She pressed her free hand against her belly as if trying to pour every last drop of love and life she still possessed into that small, fragile presence. "Please, my sweet child, please stay. Live, no matter what happens to me. I am sorry you do not have a perfect beginning, but I love you, more than anything in this world." The ambulance sped through intersections, its red lights flashing as cars pulled aside. Inside, even in her fading consciousness, Emily kept calling that name, as though if Gavin could hear her even once, she would have a reason to keep fighting. But his phone remained silent. The message remained unheard. And she, inside the bright white compartment of that racing vehicle, continued crossing the thin boundary between life and death, with only one purpose: anchoring her to the world, to protect the tiny life cradled inside her with everything left of a mother's heart. The emergency room doors swung open as the ambulance skidded to a stop, and the paramedics rushed her down the long, sterile hallway, the echo of the fading siren clinging to their footsteps. Emily lay motionless, her face drained of color, her lips barely moving beneath the oxygen mask, while her abdomen tightened in hard, unrelenting contractions, the unmistakable signs of a complicated and rapidly worsening labor. The attending physician, a middle-aged woman named Rena Alvarez, immediately took charge, her trained eyes recognizing the gravity of the situation within a heartbeat. She checked Emily's pulse, glanced at the fetal monitor where the lines had begun to dip and spike erratically, the baby's fragile heartbeat swaying with each passing minute. A nurse relayed the only information they had. The mother had arrived alone, without family, without insurance, carrying nothing but a crumpled scrap of paper in the pocket of her maternity shirt, with a name and phone number scribbled across it. "Gavin Cole," the monitor beeped, faster, sharper, like an urgent knock from fate demanding immediate action. Dr. Alvarez ordered an emergency cesarean section, without hesitation, and instructed her staff to call the number on the paper at once. A young nurse grabbed the phone and dialed while pushing the gurney toward the surgical wing. The rings echoed. 1, then 2, then 3. No answer. She tried again, her anxious eyes shifting toward the doctor. Still nothing, only the hollow sound of ringing drifting into a void. After the 7th ring, the voicemail clicked on. "This is Gavin. Leave a message if it really matters." The nurse clenched her jaw and left a short, urgent message, her voice tight with alarm. "This is Mercy South Chicago Hospital. Mr. Gavin Cole. Please return this call immediately. Emily Harris is in critical condition. We need authorization from family to proceed with the emergency surgery. Please, call back right away." She hung up and glanced at the clock on the wall, 3:45 in the morning. There was no time left. In the operating room, Emily was transferred to the surgical table as doctors and nurses worked swiftly, preparing anesthesia, sterilizing equipment, inserting tubes. Not a single second could be wasted. Even in the depths of anesthesia, she continued whispering that familiar name, the faintest murmur that made one nurse pause, listening closely. Gavin. She was still calling for him, repeating the name as if it lived at the very center of her fading consciousness, a fragile echo drifting through the darkness. Doctor. Alvarez glanced at the clock and made her decision. They could not wait any longer. The fetal heart rate had begun to fall below the safe threshold. She nodded, signaling the team to begin. The surgical staff moved into full readiness, the bright operating lights flaring like a sunrise breaking through darkness, pouring over Emily's fragile, motionless body beneath the green drapes. None of them knew who the man named Gavin was. But they knew this. The woman lying on the table had spoken his name with the very last breath of consciousness she possessed, and his number was the only thing she carried with her into the hospital, as though it were the single thread she clung to in the middle of a storm. Out in the hallway, Gavin's phone remained silent on the cold marble table of his penthouse, where he had muted it hours before, untouched, since the voice message arrived. In the darkness, life and death had already begun to wrestle over a body on an operating table, while the one man who could have known still slept inside a world built from self-assurance and the mistaken belief that everything remained under his control. But fate does not always knock before entering. And tonight, fate had called. Gavin Cole simply did not answer. In the halogen-bright operating room, as the clock slipped past 4 a.m, Emily lay motionless beneath the green cloth, her face so colorless that anyone looking at her could feel how close she hovered to the thin edge between life and death. Nurses hurried around the table, the sharp chime of metal instruments striking one another, filling the cold air that smelled of antiseptic. But in the midst of all that urgency, Dr. Alvarez froze for a heartbeat when her eyes fell upon something clutched tightly in Emily's weakened hand. The thin fingers were curled rigidly, as if holding on to the most precious thing she had left. A nurse gently pried the trembling fingers open, their skin bluish from lack of oxygen and exhaustion, and inside was a piece of paper folded into quarters, its edges damp where sweat had blurred the ink. It was not a medical document, not a contact sheet. It was a handwritten letter, each line scribbled hurriedly in blue pen, the script soft and leaning slightly to the right, the way someone writes when they have been crying. A faint mark of a dried tear stained one corner. The handwriting of a mother about to step into the most dangerous moment of her life, fully aware she might never open her eyes to see her child, never again see the man she once loved, even if that love had been shattered into pieces long ago. The nurse handed the letter to Dr. Alvarez, and their eyes met in a brief, quiet exchange that said everything neither needed to speak. This woman knew exactly what awaited her. The doctor placed the letter on the instrument tray beside her, treating it like a small, irreplaceable artifact, then turned back to Emily, whose consciousness was slipping fast into the dark pull of anesthesia. In that final moment before she disappeared completely into the drug-induced fog, Emily's lips moved, struggling to form sound. Doctor. Alvarez leaned close, hearing only 3 frail, quivering words escape like the last sigh of a fading soul. The letter, for Gavin. Then she fell completely into the darkness, her hand falling limp, no longer able to hold on to anything at all. A young nurse picked up the letter, sliding it carefully into the plastic pouch labeled with the patient's name. But Dr. Alvarez reached out and stopped her, her eyes firm yet touched with sorrow. "Leave it here," she said softly. "If we must, we will place it directly into the hands of her family." She understood, deep down, that the letter was not merely for Gavin Cole. It was the final piece of Emily Harris. The last thing she had to offer, the man she still whispered for even in unconsciousness. A letter written in desperation but filled with love, addressed to the man who did not answer, addressed to the call that had been missed and had already changed the fate of them all. Outside the operating room, along the long corridor, the sound of hurried footsteps and the steady beeping of monitors filled the air without pause. Inside, the surgery began with a single decisive nod from Dr. Alvarez as Emily's condition had plummeted within minutes. The fetal heart rate had dropped to a critical alert. Emily's blood pressure had fallen sharply. Every sign pointed to a race against time. The surgical instruments were positioned, and the focused light flooded across her tightened abdomen. The The tension thickened the air, pressing against every chest in the room as if the weight of the moment had become something solid. As the scalpel touched her skin, the letter still lay nearby, only a few steps away, quiet and unmoving like the last witness to the love Emily carried with her to the edge of life and death. Its trembling lines held hope, apologies, words meant for the daughter she had not yet met, and a final message for Gavin, the man she still believed, deep within her fading heart, could become the father her child needed. A part of her soul had been poured into those folded pages, so that even if she no longer had breath, her love could live on. Outside the hospital, dawn began to lift across the sky, pale light spreading over Lake Michigan, while inside the operating room the woman fought to bring her child into the world even as she herself slipped further away. And the letter, the final gift, the last words, the last warmth waited for the moment destiny would place it into the hands of the man who had lost everything because he had ignored a single phone call in the night. The scalpel cut a clean line through the anesthetized skin of her abdomen, the surgical lights illuminating each urgent motion of the medical team. The room fell into a near absolute silence, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor ticking down the fragile seconds that stood between her life and her death. Dr. Alvarez led the procedure, her eyes focused, though shadowed with tension when she saw how much blood Emily was losing, far more than expected. Nurses passed gauze and adjusted transfusions in a frantic effort to stabilize the collapsing blood pressure. Though the anesthesia kept Emily deeply unconscious, her body fought and faltered, her heart weakening, her pulse dimming like a drumbeat echoing from far away through thick fog. Yet even in that suffocating atmosphere, life found its way through in the smallest, most miraculous form. Just minutes after they reached the uterus, Dr. Alvarez leaned in, slipped her hands carefully beneath the tiny body that had rested inside its mother for 9 months, and lifted the silent child into the cold surgical light. A sudden, piercing cry tore through the heavy stillness, jolting the room awake. It was a girl. The moment snapped everyone back into the present. The baby was alive. A new heartbeat had begun. The nurses wiped her clean, cut the cord, and hurried her toward the neonatal care room. Her thin, urgent cries echoed even after the door closed, a fragile tether grasping at everything that now threatened to slip away. But no one had time to celebrate, for as the new life let out its first cry, the life that had given birth to it began fading in silence. Emily's blood pressure plunged into the danger zone, her pulse so weak it was barely detectable. The warning light on the monitor flashed in rapid bursts, the sequence of beeps growing faster, more desperate, like fate pounding against a locked door. Dr. Alvarez ordered more blood, chest compressions, adrenaline. Every effort was thrown into the fight, but Emily's body had become a doorway narrowing between two worlds. She did not wake. She did not open her eyes to see the child she had risked everything to bring into the world. And in that moment, no one in the room spoke. No one maintained the practiced calm they wore every day. A young nurse turned away, her eyes red and brimming. Dr. Alvarez glanced at the clock, held her breath for a few seconds, and then released the final words no one wanted to hear. Time of death, 4:18 in the morning. Emily Harris, 28 years old, did not survive the emergency cesarean that brought her child into the world. No family by her side, no hand to hold, no final goodbye, only a letter left behind, and the last whispered call of her voice, reaching for someone who was not there. In the small bassinet in the room next door, the baby girl cried in soft, uneven waves, her fragile voice rising and falling like ripples on a silent ocean. Her eyes were tightly closed, her tiny fingers curled in the air, as if searching for an embrace fate had stolen from her only minutes earlier. And in that defining moment, somewhere else in the vast city of Chicago, Gavin Cole still slept in his cold penthouse, beside the muted phone he had ignored, unaware that this would be the last night he woke as a man burdened only by his past, because when the morning broke, he would open his eyes to a reality from which there was no turning back. One life had ended. One life had begun, and he was the only one who would be forced to face both, with no amount of power or regret left to undo what had already been set in motion. The first light of morning slipped through the thick drapes of the high-rise penthouse, brushing a pale gold across the stone walls and polished wooden floor. Chicago had awakened, the sound of traffic rising from distant streets, cold gusts from Lake Michigan nudging against the wide glass windows, as if the city itself stirred uneasily. Inside, The room still carried the scent of stale liquor, smoke, and a stillness too heavy to breathe. In the armchair by the window, Gavin lay slumped back, his suit jacket somewhere on the floor, his tie loosened, his collar wrinkled, his face etched with exhaustion, deepening the lines around his eyes. He had fallen asleep at some unknown moment, perhaps after the fourth glass of whiskey, perhaps after the last time he stared at the phone vibrating with a name he had chosen not to answer. The night held no nightmares, but no peace either, only an empty, heavy quiet that wrapped around him, while he sank through layer after layer of a loneliness he had long mistaken for strength. The phone rang. For the first time in hours, the sound cut through his haze, pulling him out of the half-dreaming stupor he had sunk into. Gavin frowned, reaching for the phone lying inches away, its screen lighting the space around it. And then he froze. Not because of the incoming call, but because of the flood of notifications that appeared in a single instant. 26 missed calls, all from the same number. An unfamiliar number, unsaved, the first digits belonging to the South Chicago area code, a hospital, 2 voice messages, a system alert. His chest tightened, uncertain whether from the remnants of alcohol or something far deeper. His hand trembled as he unlocked the screen. The list filled the display call after call after call, spanning from a little after 3 in the morning until exactly 4:18, each spaced only minutes apart. The frantic persistence made his throat go dry. He opened the first voice message, a woman's voice, firm and urgent. "This is Mercy South Chicago Hospital. Mr. Gavin Cole, please return this call immediately. Emily Harris is in critical condition. We need family authorization to proceed with emergency surgery. Please, call back now." Each word hit him like a fist to the chest. He went still, blood pounding in his ears until the sound drowned everything else. Emily, hospital, critical, surgery. His fingers tightened around the phone until the joints turned white. He had not yet taken a breath before he opened the second message. A different voice now, lower, heavier. "Miss Emily Harris was taken into surgery at 4 o'clock this morning. She is currently being monitored post-operation. We need immediate contact from family." He did not know if he heard the entire message. His fingers had already released the phone. It fell to the floor with a small, sharp sound that shattered the suffocating silence of the room. Gavin sat there, eyes wide, staring into nothing, seeing nothing but the red numbers burning in his mind. 26 calls, 2 messages, 1 name he had chosen not to hear, Emily. He shot to his feet, abandoning the tie, the jacket, anything unnecessary. He grabbed his car keys, tearing out of the penthouse like a man fleeing a burning building, each step fueled by one thought that hammered through him over and over, loud enough to rattle bone. Is it already too late? Gavin stormed out of the parking lot like a force unleashed, long strides pounding across the gleaming white hallway of Mercy South Chicago Hospital, where even the bright lights could not chase away the cold tightening around his ribs. Every swinging door he pushed through stole more of his breath, as if by running fast enough he might drag time backward, pull something back from the brink he had refused to face. He still wore the same wrinkled shirt from the night before, hair disheveled, eyes bloodshot not from lack of sleep but from the weight of an entire night he had let slip away. He reached the reception desk and slammed his hand against it, his voice rough, clipped, almost a shout. "Emily Harris. I'm Gavin Cole. I got a call from the hospital. Where is she?" The older nurse at the desk looked up, a flicker of confusion passing through her eyes before softening into the practiced calm that years of work had carved into her. She looked at Gavin, then turned toward the computer screen, typing a few keys, and slowly her expression grew solemn. She rose to her feet, gestured for another staff member to take her place, and motioned for Gavin to follow her. He asked nothing. He simply walked behind her down a hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly, his footsteps echoing hollowly against the stark white walls. He saw closed doors, rolling beds, the fleeting silhouettes of doctors in white coats passing by, none of them aware of the rising panic boiling beneath his sweat-soaked shirt. At the end of the corridor, the nurse stopped before a frosted glass door, then turned toward him, her voice slowing, softening, as if preparing him for a blow that could break bone. "I am very sorry, Mr. Cole. Miss Emily Harris did not survive the delivery. We did everything we could. The baby is in the neonatal unit now, perfectly stable. But her mother, she never woke up." The world around him stopped, sound thinned, faded, shapes blurred. His chest tightened as though someone had driven a fist straight into his heart. He stood frozen, unable to form a single word, staring through the fogged window toward the room where she had taken her last breath. A vast emptiness opened inside him, hollowing out a space so large it swallowed the pride he had carried like armor for more than 15 years. She was gone. Forever. No final words. No last glance. No chance to hear her voice say his name one more time. And he, the man who had commanded lives with a nod, the man whose one phone call could shake an entire city, could not save one woman simply by lifting a phone. The nurse rested a gentle hand on his arm, as if anchoring him back from the edge of shock. "Would you like to see your daughter? She is all right, very healthy. She looks so much like her." Gavin did not answer. He nodded once, slow and heavy, as if the sky itself had collapsed onto his shoulders, but his steps did not carry him toward the nursery. Instead, he moved toward the room behind the glass, where the dim light still glowed and the curtain remained partly drawn. He placed his hand on the glass and stood there, staring into the space where she had slipped away, no sound leaving his lips, no strength left in his body, his trembling hand not from fear but from the fact that, for the first time in his life, he understood what loss truly meant. Not the loss of power, not the loss of money, but the loss of the only person who had ever believed he possessed a heart. And now, no one lived to tell him that again. Doctor. Alvarez appeared at the far end of the corridor as Gavin remained motionless before the recovery room window, the tall figure carrying an air of gravity, as if he bore a sliver of the grief he had just witnessed. He walked slowly toward Gavin, each step deliberate, the soft thud of his medical shoes echoing in the sterile hallway, as though he hoped to delay the pain the man would soon face. Gavin did not turn when he heard the footsteps approach, but his shoulders tightened, as though sensing that what came next would be more than he could withstand. The doctor stopped behind him, his voice low and careful, afraid to disturb something fragile enough to shatter at a whisper. "Mr. Cole, I have something. It is the last thing she left behind." Gavin turned his head slowly. The movement weighed down as if the entire world pressed against his spine. His eyes met the doctor's, no longer the sharp, icy gaze that once made men tremble, but hollow, shattered eyes carved by a new darkness that swallowed every glimmer of light. "Doctor." Alvarez lifted both hands, as though holding the most delicate object on earth. In his arms was a baby girl wrapped in a soft white blanket, her face pink and impossibly small, so fragile the air seemed to quiet itself to make room for her tiny breaths. She slept, her eyelids closed gently, her lips pursed as though searching for the familiar warmth of the mother she had lost forever. Gavin looked at the child, but he did not move, did not reach for her, did not lift his arms. He simply stood there, eyes wide, stunned by the reality before him. The doctor had to speak again, his voice even softer, even heavier. "This is your daughter. She was born strong, but Miss Harris, she did not survive. We did everything we could. She needs you now, Mr. Cole. There is no one else." Gavin swallowed hard, his throat tightening as though someone had severed the breath inside him. He lifted his hand slowly, touching the soft blanket before finally taking the child into his arms. The moment her fragile weight settled against him, something inside his chest seemed to break open. It was not pain. It was an endless hollow where regret, loss, and a love he had never named collapsed all at once. His hands trembled so badly that the doctor held his arm for a moment to make sure the newborn was safe. Gavin leaned down to look at her, and in that impossibly small face he saw Emily so clearly, so painfully that his breath stalled. The long lashes, the small curve of her mouth, and perhaps it was that warmth, faint yet real, that made his heart seize in a way he had never known. His chin quivered, his eyes reddened, yet no tears fell. The man who once made the entire city of Chicago recoil now stood silent, holding a life he had never known existed. A life Emily had given everything to bring into the world. But the doctor was not finished. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small envelope, the paper slightly creased but clean. On the front, in the soft handwriting Gavin knew by heart, 3 words stood out clearly. For Gavin. His heart dropped a beat. The doctor offered the envelope with a voice barely above a prayer. "She asked us to give this to you. In the worst-case scenario, she wrote it right before she went into surgery. I think you should read it." When the envelope touched his hand, It felt like a blow to the chest. He clenched the letter with his free hand, the arm holding the baby still trembling without pause. A cold shiver crawled down his spine. This was Emily's final message. The words she meant to say but never got the chance to speak. Words he should have heard in her own voice. If only he had answered the phone last night. The truth struck him so hard he nearly buckled. He stumbled back a step, his chest rising sharply, his breaths breaking apart. And at last the thing he had held back from the moment he fled the penthouse, the thing he had forbidden himself to feel his entire life, burst free. One tear, then another, then a flood. Gavin Cole, the man whose name the city of Chicago spoke with fear, stood in the middle of a hospital hallway, holding his newborn daughter in one arm, the final letter from the woman he had lost in the other, and cried. Not loud sobs, but broken sounds caught in his throat, the sound of a heart far too late to save the one thing that had ever mattered. He lowered his forehead against the baby's tiny brow, his voice shaking like a breath torn apart. "Emily, why did you go alone? Why didn't you wait for me?" And the baby's faint, wavering cry in his arms seemed to be the only answer he deserved. Gavin walked into the small family room the hospital had set aside, a quiet space with warm yellow lights and a gray sofa worn down by years of weary visitors. The door closed behind him, shutting out the hurried footsteps, the overhead announcements, and the distant, fragile cries of newborns. Inside that separate room, there was only him, the sleeping infant in the small bassinet the nurse had just brought in, and the thin letter in his hand, the last surviving piece of the woman who was now gone. Gavin sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands trembling as he placed the envelope on his knee. He did not open it immediately. He only stared at his name, written in that soft, familiar script, tilted gently to the right, a sight so intimate it squeezed his chest until breathing became almost impossible. For Gavin, 2 simple words, yet they felt like a stone pressed against his ribs, heavy enough to crush the breath from him. He swallowed, inhaled deeply, but the tightness only grew, as though his own body resisted what waited inside. Because he knew too well, Emily only wrote letters in 2 moments, when she was heartbroken beyond words, or when she knew she would never have the chance to speak again. At last, like a man stepping toward the edge of a cliff, Gavin opened the envelope. Inside was a sheet of paper folded into 4, written in haste, a few strokes of ink smudged as though her hand had trembled, or perhaps because tears had fallen while she wrote. He unfolded it, and the very first line made his eyes sting. "If you are reading this, it means I no longer have the chance to say these words to you myself." Gavin's fingers tightened around the page until the knuckles blanched. He had to pause for several seconds just to steady his breath. Emily continued, each word cutting through the softest, most hidden parts of him like a thin blade. "I know you won't want to read this, but I cannot leave without giving you something. Not to blame you. I never blamed you, Gavin, not once. I only want you to know that, even though what we had is no longer the same, I never stopped wishing you happiness. And I never stopped hoping that one day you would find the part of yourself you have buried for so many years." For the first time, a hot tear fell onto the page, soaking into the curve of her handwriting. Gavin lifted a hand to wipe it, but he was too late, because a second tear came, then a third, falling without end. He bent forward, his trembling forearm braced against his thigh, the page nearly crushed within his clenched fist. Emily wrote about the baby, their child. "I never had the chance to tell you. I was afraid telling you would trouble you, that you would resent me for forcing you to choose. But Gavin, she is the most beautiful thing in my life. I prayed that no matter what happened to me, she would live, she would be healthy, and she would have a world where she never had to be afraid of anything." A strangled sound escaped his throat, harsh and fractured, like the cracking of something once impossibly strong. He covered his face with his hand, his shoulders shaking, his breath broken, tears slipping through the gaps between his fingers like water breaching a dam. At the bottom of the letter, the handwriting grew smaller, softer, and so unbearably sad that his chest tightened with each line. "If I do not come back, please, try to love her in the way you never knew how to love me. She is the best half of you and the last half of me. I believe in you. I always believed in you, even on the days you could not believe in yourself. I hope you will not regret not answering the phone tonight. I do not want that to haunt you for the rest of your life. Live for her, and if you can, forgive me, He could not read any further, his vision blurred, the final lines dissolving into a wash of light. But he felt every painful thud of his heart, as though it were punishing him, tearing through every layer of armor he had worn for so many years. Guilt, grief, and love collided all at once, crushing every breath he tried to take. Gavin folded over himself, both hands on his head, his shoulders shaking like a man trying to weather a storm raging from within. It was the first time he had ever truly cried. Not out of anger, not out of weakness, but from the complete breaking apart of a heart that had missed the chance to hear a final goodbye. In that moment, he heard a soft sound from the bassinet. The baby stirred, letting out a tiny, weary sigh. Gavin lifted, his head, tears still on his face. He looked at her, at those impossibly small hands searching the air, and he understood. This was the last piece of Emily left in the world, the piece he had to protect. He reached out, his hand trembling, and brushed her miniature fingers. When they curled around his finger in a fragile grasp driven by instinct and need, Gavin felt his heart shatter and mend in the same breath. Emily had given him everything in one letter, and now he was the only one left to keep the promise, even when that promise had been written in the tears of the woman he had lost forever. Gavin sat in silence for a long time in that small room, morning light slanting in through the window and settling gently across the quiet space, as though the whole world had chosen to stay still for a man finally confronting the last truth about himself after years of running. Emily's letter rested on his lap, the paper softened by the tears he had not wiped away, and in the bassinet beside him, the child shifted once before falling back asleep, her tiny face so peaceful it made his chest tighten all over again. Gavin reached out and touched her cheek, the warm, soft skin sending another sharp ache through his heart. He had lost Emily, but she had left him the greatest and cruelest gift, a fragile life carrying all the love, sacrifice, and trust she had poured into him in her final moments. The baby had no one else, only him, and he would not allow her to become the second loss he carried for the rest of his life. That afternoon, Gavin filled out the birth certificate at the hospital. He sat before the stark white form, pen in hand, his eyes fixed on the line that read, "Child's name," as though it held an entire world within it. A nurse gently asked if he had chosen a name, her voice soft but unable to hide a trace of curiosity. Gavin did not answer right away. He remembered the times Emily had whispered that name during quiet, cloudless afternoons, when she curled beneath a blanket beside him, her hand resting on her belly as she murmured that if one day they ever had a daughter, she wanted to call her Leela, not for any grand reason, simply because the name felt soft, warm, and beautiful like a glimmer of light after a long storm. He had only smirked then, dismissing it as wishful dreaming. But now, in the painful reality before him, that name rose through his mind like a fragile prayer. Gavin wrote slowly, as if afraid a single misplaced stroke could break the last connection between him and Emily. Lila Cole. The name sat neatly on the page, simple yet carrying the weight of everything left behind. She was Emily's daughter. She was everything that remained. He signed his own name under father without hesitation, not a flicker of doubt, because he knew that if he did not stand in that place, there was no one else, no family, no relatives, no one to shield the child from the coldness of the world, coldness he himself had embodied for most of his life. But he was no longer the Gavin Cole he had been yesterday. He could not continue living as he once had, not after what he had lost, and especially not after the unconscious instinct with which the newborn had grasped his finger the night before, as if clinging to life itself. In that moment, he knew he had to change, not to atone, not to be forgiven, but because Emily believed he could, because his daughter deserved a father who knew how to love, who knew the fear of losing something precious, who understood the worth of gentle things he had once dismissed. Gavin stood before the nursery window, where Leela slept peacefully inside a small glass bassinet, wrapped in a white blanket, her tiny hand clenched as though even in her dreams she was trying to hold on to something. He pressed his hand against the glass, and his gaze was no longer empty. There was something new in it, a faint light, a crack in the old ice beginning to thaw. Inside him was a determination he had never known. He would raise her. He would learn how to be a father even without a single example to follow. He would make sure Lila never grew up wondering whether she was loved. He would tell her about her mother, a brave, gentle woman who chose to love a man like him and who left the world without a word of blame. And he would make sure she knew that even when a person loses everything, as long as love remains, they can begin again. When Gavin held Lila for the first time, not as a man who had just lost everything, but as a father learning how to cradle a fragile life he was now responsible for, something soft and powerful awakened inside him. The baby opened her eyes for a brief moment, her gaze unfocused, but enough to make him feel as if Emily were watching from somewhere very near. He bent down, pressed a kiss to her forehead, and whispered in a voice unsteady yet resolute, "I'm here, Lila. I'm not going anywhere, I promise." And for the first time in many years, Gavin Cole understood what it meant to make a vow not for honor, not for power, but for love. Gavin brought Lila home on a cool, early autumn morning when the sunlight was still pale and the wind from Lake Michigan slipped through every crack in the door. The penthouse that had once been a symbol of power now felt too large, too empty, too cold for a newborn to feel safe. He stepped across the familiar threshold no longer as the underworld figure who had made Chicago tremble, but as a clumsy father holding an infant, still unsure how to steady his own breathing whenever she shifted in his arms. He stood in the middle of the room, looking around a place, once filled with weapons, stacks of money, and the remnants of a life he had believed unshakable. It had been stripped clean within a single week after Emily's death. The hidden cameras, the listening devices, every instrument of a kingdom built above the law was gone, because Gavin had ordered it, the final order he would ever give as a crime. Lord. The day Lila came home was also the day he officially dissolved the organization. No meetings, no threats, no ultimatums. Just a short message sent to the men who had been his most loyal enforcers for more than a decade. From this moment on, everything ends. No one will speak my name again. No one will act in my name. Every debt, every feud, every power claim ends here. A few did not believe him. Some protested, others threatened rebellion, but Gavin did not need to speak, because the moment he faced them for the last time at the South Pier, with the cold wind beating against the water, every voice fell silent. They understood the man standing before them was no longer the Gavin they once followed, and because of that, he had never been more terrifying. From that day on, Gavin's world shrank to a few feet around the small oak crib he had placed in the center of the living room. He did not hire a nanny. He did not keep a private nurse. He mixed formula by hand, changed diapers himself, learned how to pat Lila's back so she could burp, and each night, instead of sitting in closed-door meetings, he rocked her to sleep with the classical music Emily had loved. The fingers once accustomed to holding guns now practiced writing lines in a parenting journal. Sleepless nights were no longer spent plotting escapes from federal agents or erasing the traces of money laundering schemes, but because she was teething with a mild fever, or simply because he could not stop staring at her sleeping face, afraid that if he looked away for even a moment, he might miss something forever. Gavin began reading child psychology books, watching videos that taught how to hold a baby correctly, recording immunization schedules, and even learning to cook so his daughter would not have to grow up on store-bought meals. He cut ties with everyone from his former life, changed his phone number, changed his email, and shut down every bank account that had ever moved dirty money. He transferred everything he owned into a new fund named Emily's Light, a nonprofit he quietly founded, at first to help struggling single mothers, but soon expanding into a refuge for abused women, orphaned children, and even people once like him lost in the dark, unsure how to find their way back. Neighbors began seeing a tall man with a solemn face, always carrying a baby in his arms, standing in line at the supermarket among young mothers, silently comparing diaper brands. Some snapped photos and posted them online, calling him the mysterious Chicago dad. But Gavin did not care. He only cared that Lila was healthy, that each morning when he woke, she was still there, her wide eyes opening to look up at him before breaking into a smile so innocent it felt capable of erasing every sin he had ever committed. One night, after Lila had fallen into a deep sleep, Gavin sat beside the window and looked out at the distant shimmer of the city's lights. He set down the book in his hand and inhaled slowly. Inside him there was no more turmoil, no more fear of ambush, no more hunger for power. Only a quiet ache of missing Emily and a faint belief that she was watching over the two of them from somewhere close. He whispered, speaking either to himself or to her through the soft wind brushing past his ear. "I gave everything up, Emily. But maybe, for the first time I chose right. And for the first time in many years, he smiled. Not for victory, not for dominance, but for a beginning simple, fragile, and true. Gavin chose the name Emily's Light on a late afternoon when the last rays of sunlight slipped through the tall windows of the apartment, shining across Lila's small hands as she reached into the air. She giggled, a bright sound, rare in a world once built on shadows and coldness, the only world Gavin had known for most of his life. He looked at her, then turned to the computer screen where the final draft of the Foundation's charter sat, the title in bold, Emily's Light Foundation. It was not a name chosen for branding or cleverness. It was because, to him, Emily had been the only light he had ever known. She had walked into his life quietly, without demands, without trying to fix him. She simply existed beside him, patient, gentle, and illuminated parts of him he had been too afraid to face. Now he wanted that light to continue reaching others, not only for Lila, but for the hundreds, thousands of women fighting through storms alone. Emily's Light was officially established 3 months after Lila's birth. Gavin did not hold a press conference or make a grand announcement. He simply registered the organization, moved the funds he once hid in offshore accounts, money stained with blood and with tears, into the Foundation under a new identity. He hired the best people, though none came from his old world. They were women who had been victims, who had been abandoned, who had raised children alone in temporary apartments, who had called for help in desperation only to have no one answer. He listened to each story, each circumstance, each trembling voice like Emily's once had been, and he did not judge. He asked only one question. If you could help someone else avoid what you went through, would you do it? And almost no one said no. Emily's Light began with a small center on the south side, a place few investors dared to touch, where single pregnant women often had to choose between keeping their child or keeping their housing. The first center had 3 bedrooms, a communal kitchen, and a free clinic funded entirely by Gavin, who paid for the equipment and the doctor's salary. He never appeared as its founder. He came as a volunteer, sitting quietly in the corner of the waiting room, delivering food, making beds, or playing with the children of mothers working 2 jobs to keep their families afloat. The women there knew little about him beyond the simple name Mr. Cole, the quiet man who always carried his little girl and never once refused a request for help. But slowly, stories began to spread, not through the media, but through the voices of the people whose lives had been saved. After 1 year, the Foundation opened 2 more centers, one in Milwaukee and one on the city's west side. Each center was a true home, offering not just beds and meals, but a place where someone listened, where peace existed, where no one was judged. Gavin stood behind it all, still refusing every interview request, every public appearance. He allowed Emily's name to live in kindness, untouched by the blood-stained past he carried. He wrote thank you letters to every supporter, each ending with the same line: "Thank you for helping Emily's Light continue to shine, even though she is no longer here to see it." On the 1-year anniversary of the Foundation, Gavin sat among a circle of single mothers who had rebuilt their lives because of this place. They laughed, cried, shared stories, and Lila, now just steady on her feet, wandered from person to person, her tiny arms open wide, demanding to be hugged by everyone. Someone asked Gavin why he chose that name for the Foundation. He did not answer at once. He looked down at Lila, then lifted his gaze, his eyes distant as though searching past Chicago's gray sky for a memory far beyond reach. Because she was the only light that ever came into my life, and I didn't want it to go out just because I failed to hold on to her. The room fell silent. No one needed to say anything more. They all understood it was no longer just a charity. It was an apology whispered into the world, a quiet redemption, and a journey of rebirth. Not for Emily, but for Gavin Cole, the man who once feared the light, now learning to walk out of the darkness with the love a woman left behind. One early winter afternoon, snow drifted softly outside the window, covering rooftops with a thin white dust like scattered chalk. Lila curled in Gavin's lap on the armchair near the fireplace. She was a little over 2 years old then, her eyes still wide with curiosity, her dark brown hair curling gently at the ends just like Emily's. In her hands was a picture book about birds, but she had lost interest in the drawings. She turned toward Gavin instead, resting her head against his chest, her voice as small as a passing breeze as she asked, "Daddy, where is Mommy?" The simple question tightened something deep in his chest. Gavin drew her closer, took a long breath, and set the book aside, his eyes settling on the flames dancing in the fireplace. It was not the first time she had asked, But it was the first time he felt ready to tell her about the woman who had brought her into this world, using every gentle memory he could gather from the parts of himself he rarely touched. "You know, sweetheart, your mother was the most extraordinary woman I ever met," Gavin began, his voice low and slow, each word sifted through layers of emotion he had spent years burying. "She wasn't like anyone else in my life. She had eyes that listened, a smile that forgave, and a heart big enough to love even the darkest parts of me, the parts everyone else ran from." Lila tilted her small face upward, listening closely, while Gavin looked out the window, watching snowflakes fall slowly like memories returning piece by piece. "I used to live a life that wasn't really a life. Only coldness, silence, and fear. But then your mother walked in not to change me, just to stand beside me. She loved simple things, wildflowers in a glass jar, chamomile tea at night, and old jazz humming in the kitchen while she cooked. She read books under warm yellow light, and always fell asleep with the book open on her chest, her head leaning against me. You know, she hated the rain, but she loved the smell of the earth afterward. She always wore scarves even when it wasn't cold, and she never forgot to say thank you, even to the mailman." Lila giggled when she heard Gavin tell how her mother once taught him to fold napkins into the shape of swans, and how she would turn bright red with mock outrage whenever he pretended to forget her birthday, just to see her stomp her foot in frustration. She laughed often, but she also knew exactly when silence was needed to listen. There was a night when he fell ill, and she sat beside him until dawn, cooling his forehead without a single complaint. She believed in goodness, even after being hurt. "And your mother loved you long before you ever took your first breath, long before you were anything more than a tiny heartbeat inside her." Gavin stopped for a moment, his eyes burning as Lila kept her small gaze fixed on his lips, afraid to miss a single word. "I never understood why she chose to love someone like me," he continued softly. "Maybe because she saw something I didn't believe existed anymore. Whenever I slipped, whenever I failed, she didn't get angry, she just grew quiet. And that quietness made me want to be better. Not out of fear, but because I couldn't stand the thought of disappointing her." Lila reached up and touched his cheek, then placed her tiny hand against his chest. "Daddy, did Mommy know me?" Gavin lowered his head, kissed her forehead gently. "Yes, sweetheart. She knew you from the moment you were no bigger than a little seed. She loved you more than anything in this world. And you were the gift she left for me." The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the room felt warmer from something else. From love being spoken aloud, from memories being brought back to life, from a father trying to keep a mother alive through every whispered story for their daughter. Gavin knew there would be many days when Lila would ask about her mother, and he would always be ready not to make her mourn, but to let her grow up surrounded by a love that had never faded, a love left behind in a smile, a touch, and in a child who carried the brightest part of that woman into the world. Sometimes, in the softest hours of an ordinary day, love endures simply by being told to the one who deserves to know she was born from something extraordinary called mother. Lila's third birthday arrived on a rare sunny spring day in Chicago, when the sky was clear and the cherry blossoms in the nearby park began to bloom, as though nature itself wished to celebrate a small life reaching a new milestone. Gavin rose early, baking a birthday cake from the recipe Emily had written in an old notebook, a light vanilla cake with soft cream and bright red raspberries, the dessert she once whispered Lila would surely love. The apartment no longer felt quiet the way it used to 3 years before. Now it pulsed with laughter, pastel balloons hung across the living room, and in the corner sat a stack of presents sent by the women and staff of Emily's Light. Lila wore a pale pink dress, her hair tied in 2 little buns like a kitten, running in tiny circles around the apartment with eyes sparkling with joy. Everything was perfect. In the quiet afternoon, Gavin finally gathered the courage to bring out the small leather bag Emily had taken to the hospital that night, a bag he had kept sealed in his closet for 3 years, too heartbroken to touch. Inside, tucked safely in a side pocket, he found an envelope he had never seen before. It was dated weeks before she died, with a handwritten note on the front, to be opened on Lila's 3rd birthday. Gavin froze for several seconds. That familiar weight rushed back into his chest, a cold wave, like the moment he first held Emily's final letter in his hands. But this time, it wasn't for him. It was for Lila. A gift Emily had left long before her daughter took her first breath. When Gavin opened the envelope, his heartbeat stumbled in uneven, heavy thuds. Inside was a neatly folded sheet of paper, carrying the faint scent of old paper mixed with a soft floral note, the scent he had always associated with Emily. The first line stole his breath. To Lila, on your 3rd birthday. He sat down, placed Lila in his lap, wrapped his arms around her small frame, and began reading the letter with a voice low and tender, as though each word came directly from the deepest part of a heart that had held on for far too long. My sweet girl, if you are hearing these words, it means you have grown up in your father's love. I trust he has told you about me, about our story, not to make you sad, but so you will understand that you are the most beautiful thing that ever happened to both of us. I am sorry I cannot be with you on this special day. But believe me, every day you grow, every laugh, every nap, every time you fall and get back up, I see it, I feel it, and I am proud. Lila sat still, her head resting against Gavin's chest, her eyes wide, unable to understand every word, but sensing the sacred weight of the moment. Gavin held her tighter, then continued reading. I hope you will. Always know that you are loved not because of who you belong to, but because of who you are. Brave, gentle, and full of light. You do not need to be like me. You do not need to become someone extraordinary. You only need to live with a kind heart and the belief that you deserve good things. And if one day you feel alone, remember me and ask your father, because he is the one I trusted most to carry you forward. You will see, you are never alone. By the time Gavin reached the final lines, his voice had gone hoarse, his hand trembling slightly as he folded the paper that had already begun to yellow at the edges. Live like light, my love, like your name, like the way you came into this world. Lila, my small, everlasting light, the most beautiful part of your mother's heart. Gavin sat for a long moment after he finished. The room seemed to hold its breath with him. Outside, the sunlight leaned softly through the window, settling on Lila's hair and making her eyes glow. She asked in a small voice, Daddy, Mommy really wrote that for me? Gavin nodded, a fragile smile blooming through tears he had not yet wiped away. Yes, sweetheart. Your mother wrote it before you were even born, because she always believed you were the greatest miracle she ever had. And in that moment, as Lila hugged the letter to her chest, as though it were the whole world, Gavin knew Emily was still here, in every breath their daughter took, in every memory he held, and in a love that death had never managed to sever. On a quiet autumn morning, maple leaves lay in golden clusters along the small road leading to the cemetery on the edge of the city. Gavin walked slowly, holding Lila's tiny hand, the two of them moving through rows of silent trees that stood like witnesses to a visit made without words. Lila wore a cream-knitted dress, one of the designs Emily had left behind, and Gavin wore a long gray coat, his face solemn, no longer cold as in years past, but softened by a gentleness born only from loss accepted and love, transformed into responsibility. The grave rested in the most peaceful corner of the cemetery beneath a great oak, whose branches rustled softly in the autumn wind. The simple stone marker bore the name Emily Harris, along with the inscription, The Light That Never Goes Out. Lila let go of her father's hand, ran ahead, placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums at the foot of the grave, then crouched down and whispered something very softly, as though speaking directly to her mother. Gavin stood behind her, eyes blurring from morning mist and memory. He stepped forward, knelt beside Lila, laid his hand on the gravestone, and spoke in a low, steady voice that drifted into the stillness around them. Emily, today marks 3 years since you left, and 3 years since the moment I became the man you trusted most, the father of our daughter. I cannot replace you, cannot give Lila the moments you never had the chance to share with her, but I have done and will continue to do everything within my power so she grows up surrounded by love, kindness, and the strength you always wished for her. Lila leaned her head against Gavin's shoulder, her clear eyes looking up at him. Daddy, tell me more about Mommy. I want to hear more. Gavin smiled gently, nodded, then looked back at the gravestone. I used to be a man who lived only for power, hatred, and solitude. But from the moment you walked into my life, and from the moment you left Lila in my care, everything changed. You taught me how to love, how to listen, how to live for someone other than myself, and in the end, how to forgive myself. He drew a long breath, as though trying to steady the wave of emotion rising in his throat. I promise you, with everything I have left, I will live worthy of the love you gave me. I will become a man you could be proud of. And Lila, she will know her mother was the bravest and most beautiful soul I ever knew. A soft breeze drifted through the trees, stirring the leaves like a whisper from somewhere far beyond. Lila pressed her hands together, murmured, "I love you, Mommy." Then she turned to Gavin, her eyes shining. "Daddy, do you think Mommy heard me?" Gavin placed his hand over his heart and nodded gently. "She always hears you, because she has never left us, my girl, not ever." My dear friend, if you have stayed with this story all the way to its final moment, thank you for walking beside Gavin and Lila through a journey shaped by loss, love, and quiet redemption. This story is not only a tragedy, but also a gentle reminder that love can mend even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes a single missed moment can alter the course of a life. We would love to know what this story stirred within you. How did it make you feel? Have you ever lived through something that left you with regret, or known someone who once shone like a light in your life? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Every story you offer is a genuine heartbeat we are honored to listen to. If this video brought you emotion, meaning, or simply a moment of stillness to breathe and reflect, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share so that more heartfelt stories can reach others each day. Every follow, every gesture of support from you is what encourages us to continue creating content filled with humanity, tenderness, and truth in this fast and restless modern world. Wishing you and your loved ones health, peace, and the quiet joy that can be found in the simplest everyday moments. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video where every story is a small piece of life, and every emotion is something that brings us closer together, no matter where in the world we may be.